Hello and welcome to today's tutorial. We're going to be creating this summer meadow full of a cheerful range of flowers, and there's room for interpretation to make it your own, which I think is always fun. Just some things to mention before we get started. The video has been sped up in certain places, which may be obvious, but just in case it's not, I don't actually paint that quickly and wouldn't expect anyone else to, so no pressure. And secondly, please feel free to pause or rewind the video at any time. All the materials are listed in the description box below, including this bowl which has a diameter of 15 centimeters and a jar of clean water. I'm going to be using 3 brushes from a Royal Langbickel value pack, a number 10, number 8 and number 10/0 for thin lines and small details. These brushes are a great option if you're just starting out with watercolours. Right, the first step will be to use the bowl to mark out a guide for the composition arrangement of the flowers. Lay the bowl down so that the top is about 2 centimeters from the top of the paper, and very lightly draw round the bottom half of the bowl to create a semicircle. Once this is in place, very lightly draw 6 slightly wavy lines which lean in different directions, using the semicircle as a guide for the height of the lines. Also, arrange the lines so that they vary in distance from each other, so some will be close together and others will be further apart. The 2 tallest lines at the outer points of the semicircle should be at least 1.5 to 2 centimeters away from the edge of the paper, in order to ensure everything stays within the space. The measurements for the height of all these lines are listed in the description box below. Once these lines are in place, erase the semicircle guide, as there'll be no more need for that. Okay, next we're going to paint over the lines we've just drawn in with some Sap Green paint. Now, something to bear in mind is that the thinner your brush is, or the thinner the point of your brush, the more effective and easy you should find this, as the creation of thin lines gives a much more delicate effect to the composition of the meadow. If you don't happen to have a brush that small, then I would recommend that when you paint in the stems in this painting, which is what our pencil lines will become, do it as lightly and steadily as you can. When it comes to applying the paint to your palette, use a larger brush as it'll be a lot more efficient, and make sure to mix up a generous amount of paint. Then go over to your small detail brush and paint thin lines over the pencil guides drawn in just a moment ago. Provided your lines were light enough, you shouldn't actually see them once the paint has been applied over the line. Now, I'd like to go back to talking about the brushes I'm using. I think this is a great set for starting out with watercolour painting. Don't be put off by the fact it says it's for kids, as I find these brushes work really very well for the price, which is £4.99 for 6 brushes in the UK, available in the range, which is where I bought this pack. I think they're possibly available in the US as well, judging by the website. They have a nice soft grip too, which makes them comfortable to use, as well as soft brushes which hold the paint really well. So yes, I really would recommend these. If you decide that watercolour painting is something you really enjoy and want to invest more time in, then you always have the option of buying individual brushes further along the line. But as you can probably tell, I have a lot of love for these Royal Langbickel brushes. When it comes to paints, I would also recommend buying a palette with white in it. The basic colours I would suggest you need are white, black, red, yellow and blue. You can make any colour with these five basic colours. Red, yellow and blue are the primary colours, and white and black will allow you to make your colours lighter and darker. You can mix yellow and blue to make green and red and blue to make purple and so on. However, having a number of additional colours in your palette does make things quicker and easier. In my point of view, the colours in your palette should be fairly neutral if you have a limited number of colour blocks. So this means you don't want them to be too cool with too much blue in them, or too warm with too much red in them. It's much easier to make a colour warmer or cooler if the original colour starts somewhere in the middle. If you have any questions about this, pop them in the comments down below and I'll answer them as best I can. Right, that's the 6 stalks in place. There'll be more to come later, but this gives us the overall indication of where things are going. We're going to add in poppy flower heads now on top of 4 of the thin green stems. To do this, I'm going to take a nice ample amount of flame red from the palette using the number 8 brush, and make sure the brush is really saturated with paint. To create the poppy heads, paint in circles with wavy, uneven edges. The first will sit at the top of the far left-hand green stem. When it comes to poppies, the petals tend to be very delicate, almost like tissue paper, so we want there to be areas that look a little bit sheer to make it look lighter. Certain parts of the poppies will be very saturated and vibrant, while other parts want to be more sheer, like I mentioned. To do this, drag your brush around in a wiggly, uneven circle, and at certain points, with a clean brush, pull the paint away from the edges. I would also suggest adding in some extra bumpy bits that protrude from the main uneven circular shape to give more of an impression of petals. For the second poppy head, move along to the next green line, which is a fair bit lower than the first. Use the same approach as you did for the first poppy, but this time make it a little bit smaller than the first. The layout of the flowers in this composition, with a variety of sizes and lengths, has been put together in a way that I think makes them look quite organic and whimsical. Moving on to poppy number 3, go across to the 5th green line, one away from the far right-hand side of the paper, and paint in another wavy, jagged-edged circle. This will be joined by a 4th and final poppy head at the top of the tallest and furthest right-hand green stem, which will be a little bit bigger than the other heads. Something I would suggest is to keep the 2 outer poppy heads away from the edge of the paper if you think you might frame your version. This will prevent the poppies from being cut in half once they're in a frame. Once all 4 poppy heads are painted, the next step is painting in some pieces of wheat in a nice golden brown. To do this, first we're going to mix up some yellow and brown. Put a generous amount of yellow into your palette and follow this with some brown. Then mix the brown with the yellow. When you're mixing paint together, always gradually add the stronger, darker colour to the lighter colour. In this case, it will be a matter of adding the brown to the yellow. It's a lot easier to make a colour darker than it is to make it lighter. For this part, I'm also using the number 8 brush. Once the paint is mixed into that nice golden brown, saturate your brush and start painting in a horizontal direction lines of vertical dashes in sets of 2. Paint the first dash, and then next to it, halfway up, paint in a dash of the same length. Then go back over to the first and paint in another, and continue to a length of about 5 dashes, alternating sides as you go. There are going to be a total of 8 pieces of wheat scattered around the paper, with each piece differing in height and the direction it's leaning. For each new piece of wheat that you add in, use the same approach you did for the application of the first piece. As you paint in the lines of ovals, an additional tip is to angle the ovals so that each one sits at a slight diagonal angle away from the centre point. You should also see that when I'm painting these ovals, I'm positioning my brush at a low angle, so that when I gently dab paint onto the paper, my brush can be pressed down to create delicate ovals, like the shape of grains of wheat. That's the first stage of painting in the wheat. The second step is adding in some thin spiky bits which poke out of the heads of wheat, which I believe are called anthers. I have to say I had to look that up as I had never actually considered what they might be called previously. If I'm wrong, then please do let me know, but for now I'm going to refer to them as anthers. To add these in, use the smallest brush and pull some of the paint from the points where 2 grains of wheat meet up and out. Now you might notice a bit of a pattern occurring as we go along and fill in each new stage of the painting. It's a matter of, once you understand how to paint each type of flower or piece of wheat, then repeat the process until you've painted in as many of that particular type of flower as you like, just with small alterations in size and the placement on the paper, then moving on to the next step. Hopefully this makes things a bit more simple, accessible and beginner friendly. In addition to this, it also means that you can paint in as few or as many of each flower or pieces of wheat as you like. I would also like to mention that I think it's worth rotating your paper as you paint in order to reach all the parts of the paper easily. Doing this also means you can approach the painting with your right or your left hand, and you can rest your hand on the table or desk as you paint, which keeps things comfortable. Hopefully you can see this lending itself well to painting in the anthers mentioned just a moment ago, as you can easily reach both sides of the heads of wheat. If you're right-handed like me, it's much easier to pull the paint up and out to the right with your hand resting on the table, as this is how your wrist naturally moves, rather than trying to push up and out to the left, which can feel awkward and difficult. I would suggest giving this a try for yourself with a pencil and piece of paper and seeing if you notice the difference. Now, once all 8 heads of wheat are in place, complete with anthers, we're going to give the heads some stems to sit on. Continuing with the small detail brush and the golden brown, on each piece of wheat, pull paint down from the bottom of each of the bottom grains of wheat and make a thin, gently waving line that travels down to the bottom of the paper. Some of these might overlap each other, which works well. I would also recommend pulling out a line from each stem up and out to create a sort of leaf. Again, this is where having a brush that has a small tip is ideal, because having narrow stems makes the composition feel more balanced. Once you've seen the process of how to paint all the flowers in wheat, you can take the idea and create your own designs. I've put timestamps down below in the description box for each of the flowers. In this particular painting, I've included poppies, wheat, flowers inspired by field scabious, I hope that's how you pronounce it, which are pretty and delicate purple flowers, meadow buttercups and cornflowers. You could use a combination of the poppies, wheat and buttercups to create a border if you wanted, or use all 5 different types of flowers but arrange them in a different composition. There's also the option of having a look at some of the other tutorials on this channel to learn how to paint flowers such as lavender, cow parsley and cherry blossom. I might actually follow this tutorial with a video focusing on how to paint individual flowers, so you can easily produce your own creations. Let me know if this is something you would like to see. Okay, now once you have painted in all the stems and the leaves of the wheat, which should look like they're swaying gently in a breeze that's making its way through the meadow, the next part will be to add in some poppy buds to make this meadow feel a little bit more alive. I love the way that the stems of the buds look like they're sleeping until they bloom, and then all of a sudden they pop up as if to say, "Hello world!" For this we're going to go back to the sap green. I feel like the combination of golden brown and green stems at the bottom of the paper makes things a little bit more interesting. Using the number 8 brush, paint a small diagonal oval about 1 centimetre down and across from the far left-hand poppy head, with the bud looking like it's moving towards the bottom right corner of the paper. Follow this with another green oval that mirrors the first. This time it will be over to the right-hand side of the paper in line with the lowest poppy head. Once this is done, paint a thin line that begins from the top of the bud and curves around and down in a shape that resembles a walking stick with a curved handle. Then repeat this for the first poppy bud you painted on the other side. Now, something which I think is quite charming about poppies is also the fact that they're quite hairy. So we're going to pull out some very small, thin strokes from the buds and stems, using the smallest brush again. Very lightly pull paint out from the bud and then the stems angled forward towards the top of the buds. And here we've got a close-up so you can see the poppies getting their hair, and you might also find it useful to see the wheat here in more detail too. Again, this is another place where having a brush with a really thin point is a real advantage, as it allows you to easily paint in really nice thin delicate lines. You'll want to add these thin dashes all the way down the length of the poppy stems. We'll be adding the dashes to all the poppy stems, so you can do this now if you like, or you can wait until further along the tutorial when I add them into the poppies in bloom. Right, once that's done, the next step is the addition of those small purple flowers inspired by field scabious I mentioned earlier. Apply some white, purple and a little blue to your palette and mix them together until you have a soft lilac colour. These clusters of flowers will be scattered all over the bottom half of the paper. When you've mixed your paint together, try to make sure it's got a fair amount of white in it. Then fill up your number 8 or number 10 brush, either will work for this, and paint in clusters of small circles from halfway down the paper in between the stems and the leaves of the poppies and wheat. When painting these, arrange them so that the clusters vary in size between roughly just over 1 centimetre in diameter and roughly half a centimetre in diameter. Scatter them so that groups of 4 or 5 clusters are fairly close together, so that later they can be linked together by the same stem. Also, as you're painting these dots in, take the approach that some will be touching others in the same cluster. Now, I mentioned earlier that these flowers have been inspired by field scabious. I have taken a bit of artistic license with the shape of them. If you decide to, you can have a look at some photos of field scabious flowers via a quick internet search. I think they look a little bit like purple dandelions. However, on this painting, because everything is painted with quite a loose approach, I feel you can get away with a little bit of variation in shape. As it is, I do think they look quite light and fluffy, which creates a nice contrast against the shapes of the other components in the painting. You know, I mentioned in a previous video that I was curious about trying nettle tea. Well, it happened. My husband Nathan and I went out on a nettle foraging mission with our nettle PPNE, that's personal protective nettle equipment. Okay, that's a little bit cheesy, but anyway, it consisted of wellies, jeans, rubber gloves, and a waterproof jacket to avoid being stung. We must have looked interesting. I was using Nathan's advice on the ways of nettle foraging, looking for young leaves, picking the top few leaves, and making sure that they were from plants that hadn't flowered yet. We then took them home, we washed them and brewed them in a kettle. I have to say, I didn't mind it. I found it tasted like a cross between green tea and seaweed, and it was quite a savoury flavour. However, it wasn't my favourite. I still prefer regular green tea, but I've heard that nettle tea is meant to be very good for you, so there was definitely no harm in trying it, that's for sure. I do love trying new things though, especially when it comes to food and drink, because I feel like you never know what delicious flavours are waiting for you to try, sometimes from quite unexpected places. One of my favourite things about travelling to countries I haven't been to before is trying new foods. Going back to those little lilac flowers, as you add them in, make sure you leave areas of blank space because we still need to add in the buttercups. Speaking of which, it reminds me of when I was little. I remember this funny saying people used to throw around, that if you held a buttercup up to your chin and your chin reflected the yellow colour, it was supposed to mean that you liked butter. And I remember finding the concept really peculiar because it would make my chin glow, like they said, but I didn't like butter. I've always gone for sunflower spread or olive oil spread. Okay, next it's time to start painting those cheerful yellow meadow buttercups. And again, they're going to fill the bottom half of the paper, mingling with the lovely shades of purple. Take a generous amount of yellow and pop it onto your palette or mixing tray. Using the number 10 brush, starting on the left of the paper, find a blank space in amongst the stems and lilac flowers. And using the shape of the blank space as a guide, loosely paint in a set of a combination of a couple of ovals and teardrop-like shapes at different angles that meet in the middle. You want the petals of the buttercups to vary in size and shape. You don't really want any traditionally perfect flower shapes. And in fact, having stems and purple flowers already in place can help a lot with preventing you from being too precious about the shapes of the petals. As you're painting these in, just as you did with the poppy heads, every so often clean your brush and pull some of the yellow paint away from the edges of the petals to give the impression of highlights. I'm also gently pressing down and using the body of the brush when painting each petal in the larger blank spaces. Where there is less space, the tip of the brush is more useful. In a couple of places, also paint in small yellow vertical ovals to give the impression of buttercup buds. I'm including 4, but again you can paint in as many or as few as you like. They fit in particularly well in places where there's only a very small area of blank space in amongst the other foliage. Along the same kind of lines as the glow of buttercups meaning you like butter, 2 other standout sayings I remember were, if you eat the crusts on your sandwiches, then your hair will go curly, and if you eat carrots, you'll be able to see in the dark. I remember being really disappointed when I found out that eating my crusts wouldn't make my hair curly, as my hair is very, very straight naturally, but I always wanted curly hair. But then people with curly hair would often say they wanted straight hair. So it's a funny thing when you think about it. And I suppose those sayings were supposed to be incentives for children to be less fussy eaters and eat their vegetables. Okay, now we're going to go back over to the Sap Green paint and with the smallest brush, paint in the stalks of the buttercups. Look for areas where there are buttercups fairly close together and paint thin lines which travel from the bottom of each flower head, joining the lines together in the style of a capital Y so that they look like they're part of the same plant. In places where you have a buttercup almost directly above another, paint a line that starts at the bottom of the top buttercup head and stops at the top of the lower buttercup. This way the stem will look as if it's growing behind the lower flower head. You will also find that the look of these buttercup stems are particularly effective when they're painted in a slightly diagonal direction. The other part of the buttercups to paint in is some small leafy elements dotted around the stems at different points, specifically under the flower heads and the areas where two stems meet. Use the smallest brush again and paint in small teardrop shapes with the pointed end pointing into the flower head or stem. Paint 2 or 3 at the base of each flower head and also in the places where the stems from the two flowers meet. Okay, I'm going to zoom the camera in so that you can see the buttercup heads, stems and leaves in more detail, and then you'll be able to see what I'm talking about with a bit more clarity. Again, here I'm rotating the paper as I paint in order to be able to easily reach the flowers on the left-hand side of the paper. Hopefully you will find this process quite methodical and relaxing as you move across the paper and paint in the lines which will become stems and leaves. I have to say I find it quite satisfying to see it starting to come together. You know, recently I've been watching a lot of Studio Ghibli films, and the reason I mention this is that I don't think you can do any better for finding examples of beautifully painted animated films for inspiration. Often there'll be a scene showing some countryside and a vast open sky, and I'll simply marvel at how beautiful it is. I think my top 3 are Spirited Away, Castle in the Sky, which is also known as Laputa, and Howl's Moving Castle, although all of the films tend to have the most incredible hand-painted landscapes. I think I love these films as much for the artwork as the stories. When you're creating art, it's often helpful to know what inspires you, because this will be more likely to create a prompt to push you in the direction of creating pieces of art that bring you joy. I also recently had the opportunity to see the series The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, which is a prequel to the film by Jim Henson from the 80s, The Dark Crystal, and I have to say I was seriously impressed with the visual artistry of the puppets and sets. A lot of the designs for the characters in the original film of The Dark Crystal, which were carried through to the Age of Resistance series, were created by an illustrator called Brian Froud, and his concept art is fabulous. Looking through it gave me even more of an appreciation for the film and the series as a work of art. And I would highly recommend taking a look if you get the chance. Also having a look at some of his other work as well, because his drawings are really, really lovely. Okay, now that the buttercup stems are in place, we're going to paint the stems for the lilac flowers. I'm going to refer to them as lilac or purple flowers from now on because field scabious is a bit of a mouthful. Again, just as you did for the buttercups, use the sap green and your smallest brush and paint thin lines that begin at the bottom of the clusters of purple and travel down to the bottom of the paper, occasionally connecting with other stems protruding from flower heads close by if you wish. When you drag the line down, stop when you reach the top of another flower head. Rather than pulling the line down over the top of the flower, keep it off the paper and move your brush down to the bottom of the flower and carry the line on until you reach the bottom of the paper, or you come into contact with another flower head, in which case do the same thing, just like you did for the buttercups. If you like, just to keep things interesting, you can paint in some additional thin lines which travel up and out of the lilac flower stems, a bit like smaller versions of the wheat leaves. You know, something I would love would be to hear what you would like to see painted. Are there any tutorial ideas which you would find really helpful or you would love to learn how to paint? Please let me know in the comments below, and yeah, it would be great to hear your ideas. Right, now that those stems are nearly done, we're not too far off now. We'll add some stamen, which is the part of the flower the pollen sits on, according to my flower anatomy research, by the way of small golden yellow dots in the middle of the buttercups. Then we'll put some black dots in the middle of the poppies, which should really make them pop, and finally add in a couple of cornflower type flowers. The golden yellow will be created by adding a very small amount of red to the yellow. You really won't need much because the red is a much stronger and more intense colour than the yellow, but we want to mix them together until the yellow has a nice golden tint. Before you start painting in these dots, make sure that the buttercups are dry. By the time the buttercups are dry, you should also find that the paint is dry across the rest of the paper. To mix the colours, use a larger number 8 or number 10 brush, and then once you've got your colours mixed, go back to the smallest brush. Fill up the brush with paint, and in the centre of each of the buttercups, speckle in a couple of golden dots. On some of the buttercups with slightly more wonky shapes, paint in the dots to one side or off centre to make the overall impression more organic. With all of the summer flowers out at the moment, now is also a great time to try pressing flowers, and then you can use them on a homemade card or in a scrapbook. I generally find that small delicate flowers work most effectively for pressing, so buttercups would be ideal. And it's so lovely the way the colour can be preserved so well. Actually, that might be a decent video idea. Okay, zooming in again to have a better look at how the finished buttercups look. I haven't been overly particular about the placement of the golden dots in the middle of the flowers. Like I mentioned before, the aim is to make it look organic. Now, if at any point you find you've accidentally smudged the paint, this isn't a problem. Let it dry and go over it with the colour of the smudge, lilac if it's lilac, or yellow if it's a yellow smudge, and paint an additional flower over the top of it, like I've done here. And make sure you then add in the necessary stem to connect it to the plant. And then it'll look like it was meant to be there all along. Right, next we're going to take some black for those dots in the centre of the poppies I mentioned before. Pop some black onto your palette and use your smallest brush again to put a couple of dots, I would say 4 or 5, in a position that's slightly off centre inside each of the red poppy heads. When you're applying these, make them vary in size so that some are bigger than others. I've started on the far right poppy head and am moving along and repeating the process on all 4 flowers. Okay, once the black dots are on all 4 poppies, we'll check out how the picture is looking. Now, you do have the option of leaving the picture like this. I would suggest finishing off with some hairs all the way down the length of the poppy stems, like I mentioned earlier. However, I'm now going to show you how to paint in some flowers inspired by cornflowers. We'll make a soft blue by mixing cobalt blue with white, using one of the larger brushes to mix the colours together. Then transfer over to the smaller brush. There are going to be 3 cornflowers, and the first one is going to sit in the space just above the bottom left-hand poppy. Paint in a small horizontal curve, a bit like a horizontal bracket shape, which dips down towards the bottom of the paper, just above the poppy, and follow this with another shallow curve, the same size and shape as the first, starting from the right-hand end of the first curve. This will look a little bit like a very shallow curved letter W and should fit nicely into the space available. Once you have that basic shape in place, thicken out the lines to make them a bit more chunky. Now this is followed by painting in more thin curved lines using a starting point of the central meeting place of the original 2 shallow curves. Paint up and out, starting from the left in a clockwise direction until you reach the middle. Then repeat this on the other side. Then go back over the new lines you've painted and thicken those up too. Depending on how many lines you painted, as you thicken them, you might find that there are gaps, and in these places, paint in some more curved lines and make these chunky too. The way I'm doing this is I'm keeping the ends at a point and I'm focusing on expanding the middle of each line. You'll need to go all the way around the space between the first curved line and the second until it's completely full of these chunky curved lines, which are the petals of the cornflower. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but I also have an online shop where I have all sorts of artwork available on a wide range of products, from aprons and tea towels to fabric and greeting cards, and it's regularly updated with new products and designs. It's all inspired by nature, both foliage and flowers and animals. The link is in the description box below, so please feel free to head over to take a look to see what else I get up to, in addition to making tutorial videos. I've been working with a company called Heraldic Pottery in Stoke-on-Trent in the UK recently too, on some exciting new products. Little hint, lovely bone china mugs along with coasters and table mats. I was actually able to go and visit their factory before all of the quarantine regulations came into place and see the process of how they make ceramics from start to finish. And it's amazing to see the process in action in a factory that's 100 years old. I found it quite beautiful. There was an almost physical sensation of the sense of history of all of those people who had worked there over the years. And I love that kind of heritage, so I felt quite privileged to be able to see it all in the flesh. The company also owns Duchess China, which has been around since 1888, and I'm so pleased that that's still going strong. Okay, the second cornflower head will sit in the lowest open space you have available. In this case, it's pretty central. Again, start with the two curved lines that meet in the middle and then thicken them up, just as you can see that I'm doing here. You know, I've just realised that it looks a bit like a moustache. Anyway, fill in the space in between the two curves with petals. By the way, some of the petals can be a little bit taller than others. I think it's actually a little bit more effective when you do this. And finally, over to the right and further up, close to the bottom right-hand poppy, paint in a final cornflower head, a little bit smaller than the first two. I've also positioned this one so there's a piece of wheat in front of it to make the flower look like it's sitting further back. Now I'm going to make the first cornflower look like it's further forward. You don't have to do this yourself if you're happy with how your flower head looks, but I feel like it helps to create a little bit of subtle contrast. Make sure the flower is dry, then take the number 8 brush, fill it with blue paint, and then fill the centre of the flower with blue. Go on to use the smallest brush to pull the new layer of blue out into all of the petals until the whole flower is filled with the new layer of blue. Okay, next we're going to paint in the rounded part at the top of the stems that looks like it's keeping all the petals in place. For this, fill the number 8 or number 10 brush with Sap Green paint, and directly under the centre of the flower, where the cornflower tapers up, paint in a small squat oval, and do this under all the cornflower heads. Follow this with the cornflower stems, use the smallest brush, and continuing with the Sap Green paint, pull a thin line from the bottom of the squat ovals directly under the flower head down to the bottom of the paper. When you come into contact with another flower that's blocking the path of the stem, stop, lift your brush off the paper and jump over the flower, and then continue painting down from beneath the flower that was blocking your way until you reach the bottom of the paper. Right, once that's done, the last thing to do, if you haven't already, is add hairs to the rest of the poppy stems. So just to give you a reminder about how we do this, use the smallest brush and the Sap Green paint. Then start painting in small diagonal lines which begin on the poppy stem and go up and out towards the top corners of the paper. Just for reference, these lines are about 2 millimeters in length. And here's another close-up so you can see what I'm talking about in a little bit more detail. As you can see, I'm travelling all the way down the stem and painting in these hairs on both sides. This process is very straightforward, and you should find that you get into a bit of a rhythm. It sort of reminds me of mindfulness through colouring books. I quite enjoy those myself from time to time. Hopefully, as we've gone over each step together, you've been able to see that the individual steps aren't too scary or intimidating, and when you put them together, you'll have found that you've got a painting that you're pleased with. Because although the paper now looks pretty full, as you should have found, a big part of the process is repetition. And now we're on to the final stretch, adding hairs to the last poppy stems, and then we'll be able to step back and have a look at the finished piece. If you decide to give this painting a go, or if you found this video helpful or enjoyable, please do comment below, and also please do like and subscribe for more arty content. So here is the finished piece, looking cheerful and summery, here to brighten your day. Well, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay safe, much love and happy painting.